this session is basically on the impact of the economic crisis, but focusing on the issue of what our views are on convergence, basically the issue of whether in Europe as a whole, and the European Union in particular, the process of catching up, of a trend towards equalization of living standards, and social standards if you want, has this image which appeared actually in the 2000s, and there was a well-known publication by the World Bank which pointed out that this is the one area where Europe really is working well as a convergence machine, whether this image is in place, out of place, whether the policy framework exists to recover that issue of convergence. Probably let me say a few introductory words on the economic crisis and how it shook basically the belief in convergence. I think many things were thrown into doubt through the developments of the economic crisis. And I think if we had held this conference 5, 6 years ago, I think the mood would have been very different in many respects, not only as concerns developments within the European Union, but also in relation to the impact it has on surrounding countries, on the accession processes of the next wave, on the neighborhood around it. And you can feel in today's conference that this mood has changed quite dramatically. Well, we as more academics or researchers have been thinking quite a lot about why this economic crisis took place, what it revealed, etc. And I think in some sense, honesty is important. And I think as intellectuals or researchers on the area, we do believe that there was an intellectual failure underneath what emerged through the economic crisis. And this intellectual failure led to a type of complacency that institutions, the policy framework in the EU was in the right place, basically. That membership, expectations of membership, association agreements with those countries which would be outside the EU would really deliver in that topic we are focusing on, namely convergence, in bringing up countries which are at the low level, not only in living standards, but in institutional terms, in behavioral terms, in organizational terms, would be sufficient actually to achieve that sort of aim. With hindsight, it was a bit of an intellectual failure to see that what was in place was definitely not sufficient. One was a rather quick rethinking once the crisis hit, that the policy framework within the EU, within the EMU in particular, was not really conducive to prevent what was coming out quite strikingly in the Western Balkans, but also inside the EU, that there would be severe imbalances emerging. It was covered up by superficially quite high growth rates, but underneath there was a deep-seated element of unsustainability in debt developments, in current account developments, in uneven fiscal developments, etc., which, with hindsight, one is rather astonished that not much stronger emphasis was put in the design of the policy framework, in the outcry by analysts to point out that the unsustainability of these processes, etc. Another issue which, of course, came out very clearly during the crisis is that the EU and EMU absolutely lacked stabilization functions. How would the EU react to the uneven impact of crises, the so-called asymmetric shocks, which are partly endogenous asymmetric shocks, which appear once fragility of a constellation appears? So the missing stabilization function was an amazing gap in the policy framework of the EU, which of course emerged rather dramatically once the crisis hit. Third point, which again is rather difficult to understand with hindsight why it didn't exist, the one market which probably every economist would have a priori would have said would be integrating cross-border the most intensively compared to any other market was the financial market. So the gap in governance structures, in monitoring, in supervision structures over an integrated financial market is again, with hindsight, difficult to understand why this enormous lacuna in the policy framework of the EU existed. Finally, although by textbooks one was quite aware that there will be difficulties once crisis phenomena appear and imbalances appear, there would be difficulties in re-equilibrating mechanisms. Somehow it was sort of pushed under the table, the effectiveness of equilibrating mechanism once exchange rates disappear. And by the way, exchange rates don't just disappear when countries join the monetary union, but they also disappeared for many other countries who basically because of a tradition of monetary policy weaknesses chose fixed exchange rate regimes before that. So what would take its place was really not worked upon. No frameworks were put in place at the EU or national level to find a substitute for that. But these are all now well-known issues. And I think what has happened is policies started to react to that, but we are very far away from finding solutions to these issues. And I think, of course, I would like to draw on the enormous expertise in this panel to check whether solutions are on the table, to check in 3 different directions, whether the existing policy framework is capable to reestablish what was seen as a convergence process, a convergence machine in Europe. And I would emphasize that we should not just look at EU member countries. As we saw in the previous 2 sessions, the issue of convergence should be grasped at a much wider European level, not only within the EU, but there is a certain responsibility to think about convergence over the neighborhood as well, over the countries which are in the waiting room. And I think I might even think of the absolute failure of the European economy to also deal with cross-Mediterranean failed economic development issues. So this is probing the policy framework. And of course, as a second point is quite a few things have happened and at the EU level in terms of changing the policy framework. And I would like the panel to think about judging how far we have got in the evolution of this policy framework that is evolving. Some of it has been taking place, and what is in the pipeline, if you want, and how we judge that. How is it sufficient or not? The final point I would like you to address is we can't just, as economists, think in a technocratic terms what should be there, but we should think about the political economic framework in which such changes in policy are taking place. And I would like you to address this political economic context not only at the EU level, but also at the national level, and the interaction between these 2 levels in which the political economy of what is required to change has to be implemented and activated at the national and EU level.